Hello! In this project I'm building a wooden hinged box. This is the kind of box that might work for pens on a desktop. As with a lot of my projects, I'm building to the scale based on the wood I have available, and I need to have 3 equal sized lengths out of this board. First of all, I'm going to measure up and cut off 1/3. I score with a knife and then chisel a recess to help with sawing. Check for square. This will be the front of the box. The remaining 2/3 I'm going to plane up now to make sure it has a nice edge. This 2/3 is going to make up the back and the lid for the box, and I'm going to cut the recess for the hinge while the 2/3 are still joined. This way everything will line up. So first of all I'm marking the depth of the wood, and I'm looking to find the centre point. This is where the rod for the hinge will go. This rod is 3mm. So I measure down half the distance and then half the distance of the rod, and that's my cutting depth. Using the table saw, I cut down to that depth along the edge of the board. By cutting both of these 2/3 at the same time, I guarantee that everything should line up. I make a couple of passes on the table saw because the curve of the saw is slightly narrower than the diameter of the rod. See, that rod fits in the recess there. And here's a piece of matching wood, a sapelli in this instance, which I've cut down to fit in the recess and cover the rod. With the rod in place, I glue in this piece of wood to cover the hole. I gently tap this into place, and I just check that the rods move freely and haven't been affected by the glue. When everything's glued up, I'll remove the rods. I'll cut off the excess. And I can now plane down this filler piece to be flush with the top of the board. As I get closer to the board, I adjust the plane to reduce the depth of cut, so by the end I'm just taking a very slight amount off. Once everything is planed flush, the filler piece is barely visible. But I made a modification on later boxes, and rather than cutting the recess in the edge of the wood, I actually cut it across the surface of the board, like so. In this method, the filler piece of wood is even less noticeable, and I can also hide it inside the box rather than on the top. With everything now ready for the hinge, it's time to cut these 2 pieces to length. Once again, I score and chisel to make it easier to cross-cut. I now have my 3 pieces. They should all be square and all the same length, 2 of which will have the recess for the hinge rod. and they stack together something like this. So just to test the hinge, I'll put the rod in and line up the back and the lid. Now it's time to start cutting the shape for the actual hinge. So first of all, I mark the depth of the lid along the back. Initially I'll mark up with pencil, but as I get ready to make the cuts, I'll move on to scoring with the knife. I chose a width of 3 centimeters for the hinge on the back, although this is arbitrary, and I chose 3 centimeters just because it looked like a nice size. I'm marking up which bit I'm cutting off, as I've made that mistake far too many times. With everything laid out, I'm now marking up with the knife. The knife will guide both the saw cuts and the chiselling I'm going to do to remove the excess wood. Using the square and the knife, I transfer the markings to both sides so I can work from both directions. I used a gauge to transfer the depth mark and ensure it was the same on both sides. With the back piece securely in the vise, I first chisel against the knife cut there to help guide the saw. I cut to just above the depth, and I can adjust the final bit later. I then make a series of cuts along the length of the excess wood just to help with the chiselling. And start to remove the excess wood with the chisel. At around this point my camera ran out of battery, but we can all understand what chiselling looks like. So this is the backboard with the recess cut. I'm then going to measure up and transfer that onto the lid so that I can make a mirror image so the two pieces of the hinge fit together. Again, I start the mark up with pencil and then transfer to a knife and use the square to transfer the markings to both sides of the board. This is a simpler process than the back of the hinge, as I just cut off the shoulders. No need for any chiselling. Having cut down from the top, I can now turn the piece sideways in the vise and cut down from the end to remove the shoulder. I'm taking my time as the accuracy of the saw cut's quite important here. If I take too much off at this point, the hinge will be too loose. And those two pieces should fit nicely together. Now that's a nice tight joint, which would be great if we were building a box with an overlapping joint, but this is going to be a hinge. So first of all, let's make sure everything lines up. I do this by inserting the rod. I'm only tapping quite lightly there. So for the hinge to function, we need to cut away some of the excess wood, which is creating the joint. So I do this using a file, and I'm rounding over from the inside of the box to a couple of mil in from the back of the box. I do this on the main part of the hinge and also on the hinge shoulders too. And the hinge works. It's a little bit tight and a little bit creaky there, but we can work that in and adjust with a little bit more filing. I'm just marking up the tight spots. I haven't marked out the angle of this curve, it's just done by eye. I use a curving stroke here to get it nice and rounded and take off any flat spots. Depending on how well I've cut things, I may have to go backwards and forwards through this process a few times. That's looking much closer now. With the hinge basically constructed, I take this opportunity to do a bit of sanding, as once the box is constructed, sanding the inside of the box is going to be a little bit difficult. I'm now marking up the height for the front of the box. And I'll just plane that down to size. With the back and front pieces sorted, I need to cut the recess in the bottom to take the bottom of the box. I did this on the table saw. Unfortunately at this point I realised I'd dropped a major clanger and I'd actually cut the recess in the lid as well, which obviously I didn't intend to do. I decided to make a feature of this mistake, and I had a small piece of beech lying around from a previous job, so I decided to cut this down and use it as an inlay. I simply glue the beech into the lid and clamp it up while it dries. The next job's to cut the end pieces for the box, so first of all I rip some beech to the height I want it, and then cross cut 2 squares for the end. With the end pieces in position it kind of looks like this. Again, I'm marking up which end is which, as I'm going to be measuring and cutting to the dimensions of the job rather than from a plan. And this means things should fit nicely when I've got them finished. So I mark up the height of the front, and then I take the measurements and mark the width of the back and also the top. I'm going to recess this about 4 or 5 millimeters. And what I'll be left with are the recesses in the end pieces. That should give me a nice strong joint. I simply cut down to depth and then put the block in the vise and cut across to make my initial saw cut. With everything cut, I use a chisel to tidy up the saw marks. And if I do a basic dry assembly, you can see everything in position. Let's check that lid. So the beech inlay is nicely glued up now, so all that remains is to tidy it up by planing it flat to the end and the top. I just smooth it off with a card scraper. I give it a nice sanding. I actually like the end result so much that I kept this as a feature in future box builds. I cut the hinge rod to length, just shy of the length of the box, and just smooth off any rough bits left by the sawing. I also give the rod a slight coat of wax. That will stop the hinge from squeaking and make it easier to open. Now I have to assemble the hinge before I glue the box together, because once the end caps are in place, the rod can't be removed. A quick last test of the hinge, because once this is glued together there's no going back. So after a dry assembly, with all my clamps ready, I'm start the gluing up process. Once the glue's in position, I'll start to clamp, and as I go round I'll check for square to make sure I haven't pulled anything out of shape whilst clamping. I can make some slight adjustments as I go. I keep checking the lid still opens. Now I'm happy everything's square, I'll leave that to glue up. So that's been gluing up for a day now. Now it's just a question of fitting the bottom. I'm using a 4mm ply as the bottom here. So with that all safely glued up, that's the construction of the box complete. Now it's just time for final preparation. First of all, I'll give it a good sanding all over. And now I want to round off those front corners. Again, I'll use the file to do this. I use a rolling motion with the file to ensure there aren't any flat spots. And I use sandpaper to smooth everything off, and also to break the corners on the rest of the box so nothing's too sharp. And I'm going to finish this box with a few layers of Danish oil, which I'll just wipe on initially. I'll leave the first layer to dry for a day or so, go on with other jobs, and then give a light sanding before applying another layer. I applied 3 layers overall on this job, and the final layer I applied with a fine grade wire wool. And here's the finished box. This is a variant on that design that I made. This time I've inset the front panel a little bit and allowed the lid to overhang. I've also added some detail on the bottom to match the overhang of the lid. Well, thanks for watching, and please subscribe for more projects.